All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. All right, Chavra on Zoom, you still hear me all right? Excellent. Excellent. All right. All right, so we'll say good morning. It is wonderful to be back with all of you. A tremendous Yashkat to Rabbi Kalman Akiva, to Rabbi Richter for giving the shiur over the last couple of days. A great Zechus Baruch Hashem to be back here with all of you in Meseches Kesuvos. So let's get right into it. To begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsor, Shmuel and Liba Dinovitz, for dedicating all the shiur and drashos in the memory and the schus for the aliyah of the neshama of Shmuel's father, of Paras Avram, Ben Rab Binyamin Moshe. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Ira Miriam Grossman, in commemoration of the outside of Ira's beloved mother, Freda Grossman, Freda Bas Shmuel, Zechron Livracha. We hope down to the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshamas will have an aliyah, and the family's a nechama. And we'll say with that, let us begin. Okay, so we'll say today's daf is Chof 20, and we are picking up Emirat Hashem on Yud Tes Amud Beis at the Tanur Rabbanon, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom. Tanur Rabbanon, we'll say, so again, a really incredible sugya ahead of us today, some fascinating gemaras, having to do again, halacha l'maisa, with kiyum shtaras, right? How we go ahead and uphold certain documents, or how we go ahead and validate certain signatures as well. Tanur Rabbanon, Shnayin chasumna ala shtar. Here's the case. You have two individuals who signed on a shtar, umeisu. So we'll say, we'll call them Reuven and Shimon. So if Reuven and Shimon signing on a document, now we'll say, now we have to verify this document. Now in this particular situation, something interesting occurred, which is, Reuven and Shimon are dead. So they're dead. So obviously, again, they cannot go ahead and attest to their own signatures if they're no longer in Olam Hazeh. So what happens? So we'll say, now what happens? So Levi and Yehuda show up. And Levi and Yehuda say, we know that the signatures here, in fact, do belong to Reuven and Shimon. Those are Reuven and Shimon's signatures. But, Aval, Anusim Hayu, Kitanim Hayu, Psule Edus Hayu. So now what happens? Levi and Yehuda are coming along and attesting to the fact that this is indeed Reuven and Shimon's signatures. But what they are doing is they're qualifying those signatures. And what are they saying? The signatures are in fact invalid. Why are they invalid? Because Reuven and Shimon were coerced, or Reuven and Shimon ultimately were ketanim, they were children, or they were psule eidos, they were not really permitted to give testimony in this particular situation. So what's the halacha in this situation? Hare elu ne'emanim. Ultimately, Reuven and Shimon are believed. I will say, now again, not Reuven and Shimon, Levi and Yehuda are believed. Why are Levi and Yehuda believed? So I will say, this is a continuation of the same principle that's been guiding us over the last couple of days, which is hapesha asar, that at the end of the day, if you are the source of information that we would not have known without you, then the same way we believe you to convey that information, we also believe you to qualify that information. So since at the end of the day, Levi and Yehuda are coming along and telling us, yeah, that's Reuven and Shimon's signatures. There are their signatures, and we would not have known that those were valid signatures without Levi and Yehuda. Therefore, again, because Levi and Yehuda are the source of information, Levi and Yehuda are believed to qualify the information as well, which the irony, of course, is in their effort to go ahead and validate the signatures of Reuven and Shimon, what do they effectively do? They invalidate the document. They invalidate the document because they say, yeah, the signatures belong to Reuven and Shimon, but Lamaisa, again, whatever the situation was, they were coerced, they were kitanim, they were psulim, whatever the situation was. However, part 2, v'miesh edim sheksav yadam huzeh osha eksav yadam yotzei makom acher mishtar shekar lav irer v'hochsak bebezdin ein elu ne'emanim. However, we'll say this is a simple qualification. If we know that these are Reuven and Shimon's signatures from another source, let's say even before Levi and Yehuda showed up, we know that halacha l'maisa, those are Reuven and Shimon's signatures. That's what it means. Ksav yadam yatsa mimakom acher mishtar shekara alav irer. Now, we'll say we're going to talk about this part in the Brisa because it's interesting that the Brisa feels the need to say this. Let's say we have another document. There was another document, and someone contested this document. That's what it means when it says Shekara alav irer. It was a document that came before Beis Din because, let's say again, whatever the borrower said, it's a forged document. So the document was challenged in Beis Din. The document had Reuven and Shimon's signatures on it, and the Beis Din upheld the document. And by upholding the document means they upheld Reuven and Shimon's signatures, which I will say is another way of saying we already know that it's Reuven and Shimon's signatures from another source other than Levi and Yehuda. In that case, Ein Elu Ne'emanim. Levi and Yehuda are not believed to go ahead and say that Reuven and Shimon's signatures were invalid. So I will say, a very simple case. It's actually, we've seen this a number of times already. One more time outside. Right, we have a document. A lent B money. Right, B is claiming the document is fraudulent. The witness is never signed. Right, those witnesses are made up. They bring the shtar to Beis Din. Right, document has the signatures of witnesses Reuven and Shimon. Levi and Yehuda come along and say, you know what? We testify, those are Reuven and Shimon's signatures. But we just want to tell you, we also know this transaction, and Reuven and Shimon were minors, they were compelled, whatever the situation was. So ultimately in that case, Levi and Yehuda are believed. Because since they are the source of the information, therefore they are believed to qualify the information. Part 2 of that case is, if we happen to know that these are Reuven and Shimon's signatures already. How do we know? Because we had another document that was also contested, that was vetted in Beis Din. And now we recognize the signatures, the same signatures. So we know the signatures in the document in front of us are from Reuven and Shimon. So we have essentially independent corroboration of the validity of the signatures. When Levi and Yehuda come along and say, Reuven and Shimon, they were coerced, they were young, we don't believe them in that case, which makes sense because Lamaisa, we've validated the signatures without their testimony. Therefore, there is no Pesha Asar Pesha Hitir. Incredible. Says the Gemara, so does that mean then that we would treat this like a regular shtar? So I'll say, let's play this out a little bit. So now we would just treat it like look at Rashi for just a moment. Actually, no, not yet, sorry. We would just correct, Rashi's Babina Bey, Bitmiya. We would just collect from this shtar just like a regular shtar. So the Gemara says, how could that be? Trei utreininu. Rabbi will say, is this not a classic case of 2 witnesses against 2 witnesses? I will say, let's play this out for just a moment over here. A lent B money. Too many names over here, right? A lent B money, right? So now what happens? So now B wants to claim, I don't know, he paid back the shtar, it was a fraudulent document, whatever it was. But it doesn't have to be a loan. It could also be a real estate transaction. You can fill in whatever transaction you want. So now what happens? So now A, the creditor, produces a document. The document has the signatures of Reuven and Shimon in it. Okay, so now, fine, now the document is being challenged. So step 1 in Kiyam Shtaras, in upholding a document, certifying a document, is to make sure you have valid witnesses. Problem is, Reuven and Shimon are dead. So what happens? Levi and Yehuda come along, and they testify, yeah, that's Reuven and Shimon's signatures, but remember, what do? They give it a qualification. What's the qualification? It's their signatures, but the whole transaction is void. Why? Because Reuven and Shimon were minors. Reuven and Shimon were coerced by the creditor, whatever the situation is. So I will say, what's interesting about this is as follows. The Gemara says, here's the problem. Is this not a classic case of trei? In other words, I will say, what we have over here is, you have two witnesses who say that the shtar is good. Who are the 2 witnesses that say the shtar is good? Who? Reuven and Shimon, who are the signators. They say the shtar is good. I have Levi and Yehuda who are saying the shtar is not good. So I will say this is a classic case of trei. Now, whenever you have 2 witnesses against 2 witnesses, at the end of the day, what do you normally do? Maintain status quo. That's normally what happens. So the Gemara says, so I will say, see, here's what's interesting. What the question is really, I think we're going to have to move on. What the question is really focused on, it's such a fascinating case. The mechanics are fascinating. What's just fascinating about this particular situation, I will say, especially in the second case, is essentially where Reuven and Shimon, the validity of their signatures is already known from elsewhere. It seems to be that we totally discount the testimony of Levi and Yehuda that the signatures are invalid. And the Gemara is essentially questioning, which means that we would allow you to go ahead and collect with the shtar. So essentially the Gemara is saying, how can you allow someone to collect with the shtar? don't we have two witnesses against two witnesses? I've got Reuven and Shimon signed on it, but I've got Levi and Yehuda testifying that at the end of the day, the signatures are not good. So how can you collect with such a star? So the Gemara will say a couple of approaches. We'll say this is fascinating. There are two different ways in which you can go ahead and invalidate Eidus. One is Hachosha, one is Hazama. What's the chelek? Let's work backwards. We'll say Hazama is the class. What's Hazama? Reuven and Shimon show up and say, we saw A kill B. We saw A kill B. Levi and Yehuda show up and they say, Reuven and Shimon, impossible. You could not have seen that event. Why? Imanu hayisim, you were with us. So we'll say, that's called Hazama, where the second set of witnesses tell the first set of witnesses, you're lying. You could not have seen what you claim to have, which could not have seen what you have claimed to have seen, because you were with us at the time of the event. Now I will say, remember in Hazama, the second set of witnesses are not weighing in as to whether the event occurred or not. Maybe A did kill B. That's quite possible. Lamaisa, what they're saying is what? Right, Reuven and Shimon, there's no way you guys saw that. There's no way you guys saw that because you were with us. That's Hazama. Hachosha is good old contradiction. Right? Two witnesses say A, and two witnesses say the opposite of A, right? So now I literally just have two witnesses against two witnesses, and they're just duking it out a little bit over here. So listen to this. Rav Shesha says, Zosomeres, Hachosha Tchilas Hazamahu. So this is actually very interesting. Rav Shesha says that by definition, built into Hazama, Edim Zomamin, is Hachosha, which makes sense. In other words, within every Edim Zomamin, there is an inherent contradiction of testimony. So the beginning of any Hazama is Hachosha, which is another way of saying these two processes are linked. Top of Chav, Ukishem Shein Mazimin as Ha'edim Ela Bifnehem, Kach in Machishin as Ha'edim Ela Bifnehem. Oh, I will say, now once I understand that the processes of Hachosha and Hazama are linked, because if you think about it, by definition, in order to make Edim Zomamin, what you have to say is what? What you have to say is what? That what you're saying is not true. That's Hachosha. So therefore, Rav Shesha says, the same way that you cannot make Edim Zomamin, unless you are in their presence, so too you cannot do Hachosha unless you are in the presence of the original witnesses as well. Now I will say, if you look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi quotes over here, we're not going to get into it now, but Rashi explains how you know that you can't make Edim Zomamin unless you are in the presence of the first set of witnesses. In other words, there's no such thing as making people Edim Zomamin in absentia. Right? And the logic behind that is because since the whole chap of Edim Zomin is reciprocal punishment, everything has to be done in front of the original contradicted set of witnesses. So look what Rav Shesha says, it is incredible. Rav Shesha just linked the processes of Hachosha and Hazama, and he said the same way that you could only do Hazama in the presence of the contradicted witnesses. In the presence of the contradicted witnesses, you could only do Hachosha in the presence of the contradicted witnesses. Rabbi said, let's apply this. How does this help us in our case? This is why, remember again, Rabbi said in our case, right, everything is centered on the signatures of Reuven and Shimon. What's Reuven and Shimon's current state? Dead, right? So therefore, again, there's no bifnehem. Because there's no bifnehem, therefore there's no hachasha. Because there's no hachasha, there's no contradicting dead witnesses. Therefore, what? Halacha l'maaseh in case number 2, where we have Reuven and Shimon's signatures validated from an external source. When Levi and Yehuda show up and they start to say, no, but the signatures were not good, they were compelled, they were minors, we simply don't listen. Rosh Hashanah says because of a technicality, because hachosha, contradicting testimony, could only happen in the presence of the witnesses whom you are contradicting. Fascinating technicality. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara, Nachman says that doesn't make any sense. So we'll say, so just to be clear, what we're just trying to figure out is in case number 2, where Reuven and Shimon's signatures have been upheld through an external source. Right? So therefore again, we've validated their signatures. Now remember again, Levi and Yehuda are showing up and saying, yeah, it's Reuven and Shimon's signatures, but, and it's a big but, what they're saying is, but, they were compelled, they were minors, they were coerced, whatever, so therefore the shtar is not good. The Brisa said, we don't listen to Levi and Yehuda. So the Gemara is bothered by that, because how can you not listen to Levi and Yehuda? You have 2 witnesses against 2 witnesses. So again, answer 1 of Sheshes, no. Because Levi and Yehuda, in order to contradict witnesses, you have to do so in their presence. And since Reuven and Shimon are dead, therefore by definition, the ability to contradict their testimony is no longer there. Incredible. Next, Rav Nachman questions this. Rav Nachman doesn't make any sense. If Reuven and Shimon were alive, and Levi and Yehuda came and wanted to contradict their testimony, so we'll say that would work. That would work. And therefore, we would not listen to Reuven and Shimon when there was another set of witnesses coming along and contradicting them. Now Reuven and Shimon are dead. And we could say, you know, we'll say there's always an interesting possibility, which is what? Imagine Reuven and Shimon were alive. And now Levi and Yehuda showed up, and they said, Reuven and Shimon, it's your signatures, but come on. You guys were coerced, or you were minors. There's always the possibility that what? That Reuven and Shimon would admit it. Admit it. Rav Nachman says there's always that possibility. So the Gemara says, so I will say, therefore Rav Nachman argues on Rav Sheshes. Rav Nachman says it can't be that there's no such thing as hachasha outside of the presence of the original witnesses. There has to be the ability to contradict testimony at any point and at any time. Therefore Rav Nachman has a different resolution. Uki, here we go. Uki trei lahade trei, v'uki mamona becheskas marei. So Rav Nachman says, the truth is, it's very simple. When you have a case like this, Rabbi say, and again, in this particular case, where what's happening? Reuven and Shimon signed on a document. Reuven and Shimon died. So now what happens? We validate Reuven and Shimon's signatures from an alternate source, but let Levi and Yehuda show up in Beis, and Levi and Yehuda say it's true that it's Reuven and Shimon's signatures, but what? They were minors, they were coerced, essentially invalidating the get. So Rav Nachman says like this. On one hand, I have Reuven and Shimon's signatures in the document. Rabbi say, is that meaningful? Is that meaningful? Absolutely. Because signatures in the document effectively are like what? Like what? They're eidos. They're eidos. But on the other hand, what else do I have? I've got Levi and Yehuda standing in front of me in Beis Din telling me that Reuven and Shimon were coerced or were minors. That's also meaningful. So if Rav Nachman says there's only one way to resolve this. Uki trei lahade trei. What do you have? You have 2 against 2. Rabbi say, what do you do when you have 2 against 2? V'uki mamona becheskas marei. Keep the money. And by the way, we're using money, we'll say, but it would apply to property or anything else. Keep the money or the property in wherever it is presently situated. So whoever has the money, whoever has the property, essentially, when you have contradiction within testimony, maintain status quo. Maintain status quo. So the Gemara says, Midi dahavya the bar shatya. This is very interesting, because this is like the case of the property of bar shatya. They will say, what happened with bar shatya? Fascinating. The bar shatya zavin nechasi. Bar shatya went ahead and bought property. Okay, bought property. So what happened? Asi beit trei. So 2 witnesses showed up, and they say, Amri kishu shote zabin. When he was crazy, apparently bar shatya had episodes of insanity. He wasn't a well individual. He had moments where he was lucid. And moments where he lacked proper capacity. Most of us are like that, right? I'm saying, so he had moments where he just didn't have capacity. So the Gemara says, so what happened over here? So Bar Shatya bought a piece of property. Now witnesses showed up and said, by the way, the sale is invalid. Why is the sale invalid? Because we happen to know that at the time that he went ahead and bought the property, it was one of his periods of shtus, one of his periods of insanity, and therefore he lacked capacity, no transaction. So the Gemara, another 2 witnesses came along and said, no, he was perfectly fine. He bought it and he was perfectly fine. I will say, by the way, also an incredible Musar Haskell, how people could perceive the same event, and yet see 2 dramatically different things within the same event. People can know the same person, and some people could say, a tzaddik, and someone else could say, a shota. Right? I will say it's so important, because when what we see in life, whether when you see people or when you see situations, just understand, never are you seeing objective truth. What you're seeing is your version of events, your version of MS, your version of truth, but your version of truth comes through your life filter. which is very much impacted and affected by your life events, by your dispositions, by your proclivities. So important to always know that what we see in other people and what we see in life is never objective MS. It's our subjective MS. So you see this machlokes over here. Right, two witnesses saying Bar Shati was completely lucid. Two witnesses saying Bar Shati was out of his mind. So I will say, so what happened? So Rashi says, what do we do? So what do you do over here? We'll say, so what do I have? I've got two witnesses saying Bar Shatia was lucid, valid transaction, right? Valid purchase. Two witnesses saying that Bar Shati was out of his mind, invalid transaction. So I've got two against two. What do you do? Maintain status quo. We'll say, what was status quo in this case? Bar Shatia was already in possession of the real estate. He was already in possession of it. So therefore, I've got two witnesses against two witnesses. Keep the money where it is, and that's it. Which I will say, by the way, this is one of the classic ways in which we resolve monetary dispute where no one has an upper hand claim, right? Everybody's bringing their witnesses, two witnesses against two witnesses. Halacha often just says, maintain status quo. Uki mamona becheskas mare, leave the money where it presently is. So the Gemara says, v'lo amran, now it's interesting, the Gemara qualifies the Bar Shatia case, v'lo amran ela de'isle chazaka da'avase. Now this is incredible. Actually, there's a big qualification here. The Gemara says we only say that we would keep the property with Bar Shatia when halacha l'maisa, this property was actually belonged to Bar Shatia's father. They are talking about property over here that Bar Shatia inherited. So look at Rashi. But I will say, if we're actually talking about over here a piece of property, that's what? That Bar Shatia went ahead and bought himself, we have a problem. Why? Because Amrinon Kishu Shota Zaban, Ukushu Shota Zavin. It's just as possible that he was a Shota when he bought it, and a Shota when he sold it. So this is just an interesting aside. In the Bar Shatia case, the only way that Chazaka works is if we know with absolute definity that this property belonged to Bar Shatia. Now, the only way to know with absolute certainty that this property belonged to Bar Shatia is how? Is if it's inherited property. Because assuming that his father was a normal guy, right, a healthy guy, a with it guy, so then Lamaisa, Bar Shatia inherited the property, which means we know with absolute certainty that at some point in time, the property was absolutely his. But interestingly enough, if we're actually talking about property that was bought and sold by Bar Shatia, that's a much bigger issue. Because there we could say the same way that maybe when he sold it, he was a shota, when he bought it, he was a shota, and therefore maybe there's absolutely no ownership on part of Bar Shatia at all. So if you look at Rashi, he says, if we're talking about property that Bar Shatia himself bought and didn't inherit, and at the end of the day, I will say, really quite fascinating. There will be no chazaka. Ultimately, again, there will be no chazaka. So going to be mevatal's mechira. So we'll say we don't have to get into the specifics of Bar Shatia, but our point over here is what? Our point over here is that whenever you have tray against tray, two witnesses against two witnesses, what's our mechanism of resolution? Uki mamona becheskas mare. Leave money wherever it is. And this is how Rav Nachman would be understanding the second case of our brayso today as well. Rabbi Avo gives another resolution. He says, Ein mazimin asaidim ela bifneihem. So I'll say, well, this isn't really a resolution, it's an approach. He says like this. So Rabbi Avo goes back. So remember again, Rav Sheshes wanted to say that the same way that you can't do hazama when it's not in the presence of the first set of witnesses. In other words, a second set of witnesses can't make the first set of witnesses into Eidim Zomamin, so too you can't do Hachasha, right? You can't contradict witnesses if you're not in their presence as well. Rabbi Avo says, wow. Rabbi Avo disagrees. He holds that Allah Lamaisa, it's true. Hazama cannot be accomplished if you're not in the presence of the first set of witnesses. In other words, if Reuven and Shimon give testimony that A killed B, and Alevi and Yehuda want to show up and they want to say, Reuven and Shimon, impossible, you're lying. You cannot have seen that event because Imanu Hayisem, you were with us on that particular day, that particular time. In order for Shimon and Levi to make, in order for Levi and Yehuda to make Reuven and Shimon Eidim Zomamin, so ultimately again, Levi and Yehuda have to do this in the presence of Reuven and Shimon. Okay. However, umachishin as ha'edim shelo b'fneihem. But achosha, in other words, contradicting testimony, can be done even not in the presence of the original witnesses. So the Gemara says, V'azama shelo b'fneihem nihid hazama lo havi hachashim yahavya. A very interesting qualification. So I will say, so what happens if second set of witnesses do hazama not in the presence of the first? While it's true that it's not hazama, what is it? It's hachasha. It's still contradicting. Still contradicting. And I will say, remember again, look at Rashi. Nihid hazama lo havya lo onsham lo nefesh v'lo mamon hachasha havya levatel edusan. So I will say, this is a really interesting idea over here. So Rabbi Avo comes along and is saying that halacha l'maisa, hachosha, contradicting, second set of witnesses contradicting a first set of witnesses, can be done even if the second are not in the presence of the first. That works. Amar Mar, im yesh edim sheksav yadam hu. So we'll say, now we're going back to the Brisa for just a moment. So according to the Brisa, im yesh edim sheksav yadam hu zeh. O shahayek sav yadam yotze mi makom acher mishtar shekara alav ir v'hochsak bebezdin ein ne'emonin. So we'll say this is just a quote from the Brisa. So what did the Brisa say? So let's go back for just a moment. We have now a document. We have now a document that A lent B money. The document is being contested. The document comes to Bezdin. Right? The Eidim signed on that document are Ruvain and Shimon. So in case number 2 on the Brisa, what we say is like this. If there was another document that came before Bezdin that was also contested, and Reuven and Shimon signed on that document as well, and we validated their signatures on from that first document, the validation from the first document could serve to certify what? The document in front of us right now. Document in front of us right now. And we'll say, by the way, the second part of the Brisa says, therefore, when Levi and Yehuda show up and say that Reuven and Shimon signed it, but they were minors, they were coerced, we don't listen to them under those circumstances because we already have independent corroboration about the validity of Reuven and Shimon's signatures. Good. The Gemara makes an interesting diuk. The Gemara says, I don't understand. The Gemara says, Kara alav irur in, lo kara alav irur lo. Why does the Brisa say that Reuven and Shimon's signatures were certified from a contested document, as opposed to just saying we recognize Reuven and Shimon's signatures from another document? It sounds like certification of Reuven and Shimon's signatures can only be done based on a document that was contested in Bezdin. Why is that? Misayei Rabbi Asi. Here we go. Then Rabbi Asi says, Ein mekaymin es ashtar ela mishtar shekar alav iror v'hochsak bebezdin. It's very interesting. Rabbi Asi is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, the only way to go ahead and uphold signatures of witnesses from one document to another, in other words, I just want to compare signatures, is if it was a document that was contested in Bezdin. Look at Rashi. Ela imkein kara irur al osa shtar ha'acher v'hochsak bebezdin al yidei edav dilo karlav irur chashinan dama hahu gufei mezuyefu. Rabbi say this is fascinating. See, up until Rabbi Asi came into my life, I would have assumed as follows. How could I go ahead and certify signatures on a document? Bezdin, I will say, Bezdin on any given day, goes ahead and sees multiple shtaros. And I will say it's also possible that you have the same witnesses signing on a number of different shtaros, right? Either because maybe sometimes Bezdin had on-staff witnesses, right, which a transaction happens in front of Bezdin, or maybe there's just 2 guys who you know are always around, right? Reuven and Shimon, they're always around. So they're available to go ahead and witness stuff. So before Rabbi Asi came along, I would have thought to myself, the truth is the way I go ahead and validate signatures like this. I have Reuven and Shimon signed on document A, right? But I also know that what? They've signed on other documents. Let me just produce another document, right? Based on just compare. As long as the signatures sign up, we're good to go. Rabbi Asi says no. The only way to validate signatures of witnesses from previously existing documents is if those previously existing documents were contested. And then validated. Because I will say, if they weren't contested and then validated in Bezdin, we're concerned that the original source document may be forged as well. In other words, if a document was never contested and never validated, how do you really know it's accurate? Maybe the document that you're comparing, maybe the original document that you're comparing the current document to was mezuyah, was forged. So therefore, Rabbi Asi, the only way to know that the source document that you are comparing the present document to is in fact valid is if it was contested and ultimately upheld in court. That's Rabbi Asi's opinion. Amrin Ardoy, the Nardoim say, Kesuvos or mishtei sado. So we'll say the Nardoim come along, they're not arguing, they're just giving an alternate form of validating as well. You could also go ahead and validate signatures from two other documents, right? I will say, for example, if you find Reuven and Shimon having signed on two other Kesuvos. In other words, so the Nardoim are bringing in is, even if you don't have a contested document, but what? You find their signatures on multiple other documents. If you have two other forms of proof, right? Two Kesuvos or mishtei sados, or two other real estate transactions. But with those real estate transactions, they have to be the kind of real estate transactions that the owner has utilized the property for 3 years in an uncontested fashion. In other words, so the Nardoim are just adding in, if you could produce two other documents to certify Reuven and Shimon's signatures, that works as well. I'm going to say Ra'ashi, this is very interesting. However, this only works when the additional documents that are going to be used to certify Reuven and Shimon's signatures come from someone other than the present document holder. Others will say, just to imagine the situation, right? Reuven lent Shimon $1,000. Shimon's claiming it never happened. Okay, so Reuven says, here's the shtar, and Reuven, right? I'm sorry, I keep using the wrong names, right? A lent B $1,000. So what happens? So B is claiming never happened. So A produces the document, and I said, look, Reuven and Shimon are signed on it. So that's proof. Everybody's saying, what else does A do? A also produces 3 other documents that Reuven and Shimon signed on. Nah, I don't think that works, right? In other words, if we're going to go ahead and validate Reuven and Shimon's signatures from other documents, the other documents have to be sourced elsewhere. They cannot come from the person who's holding the present document. So Gemara says, why not? Why is it that if A produces the 2 other Kesuvos, right, or the 2 other real estate transactions, that's not going to be good enough to go ahead and uphold Reuven and Shimon's signatures? Very simple. So the Gemara says, Dilma Zuyef Mizayef. What do we say? Because maybe A got a hold of these other documents, and what happened? He studied how to go ahead and forge Reuven and Shimon's signatures, and that's what he's done on this current loan document. To which the Gemara says, one second, Mitachas Yedei Acher Nami Dilma Azal V'Chaza Asav Zayif. Maybe it will say, so I don't understand. Maybe even if A doesn't have the documents, maybe A saw the documents somewhere else. He studied the signatures, and maybe he still forged Reuven and Shimon's signatures on the present document, even though he's not in possession of those original documents. To which the Gemara says, Kuli Hailo Matzi Mechavi. We'll say, we assume that people could do forgeries. But we'll say, in order to do a forgery, what do you need? What do you really need? You need time with the source document, right? In other words, so if Reuven is the one producing the 2 other Kesuvos, the 2 other real estate transactions, and now he has a loan document that also have Reuven and Shimon on it, then I have a concern that maybe he studied the other signatures very closely and forged this current document. But I will say, to get a quick glimpse of signatures on someone else's document and then be able to replicate that on your document, that we don't assume people could do. Tan Rabbanon. I will say another fascinating case. Listen to this. I will say, this always bothered me. I will say, sometimes you witness an event. Right? Let's say, right, and then what happens? Then what happens? Years go by, you don't remember the event. Now the truth is, many times this happens, like if you get a kibbut or something at a chasana, someone reminds you, oh, it was so special to have you as the aid kiddushin under my chuppah. Like, yeah, it was very special. Just remind me your name once more, right? And I say, so Lemaisa, here's something so fascinating. Let's say I witness an event. But my memory is not what it used to be. So Rav Huna now comes along. The Raisa says, I could write down the testimony. I could write down the events so that if I'm ever asked to recall it, I could access it right from this document. And I will say, now what's interesting about this is as follows. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Kosev Adam, emasu ebedavar v'yari l'shochacho, kosev al chatichas klaf umatzniya. Somebody asked me to witness something. I'm nervous I'm going to forget the details. I can write down the testimony, and therefore if I'm ever called upon to recall it, I have it there. Rashi says, umeyed, api osiksav. So what's the novelty, Abosai? So listen to this. Amar Rav Huna, v'husha zochra me'atzmo. Rav Huna says, but it has to be that at least you remember some details on your own. Look at Rashi. Shezochra me'atzmo, below uriyas hashtar niskar ktsas me'edusa me'elav. Rav Huna says it has to be that you remember some of the details on your own. In other words, if you remember nothing at all, and you're just going to read from a piece of paper, that's not enough. There has to be that you remember some of the details. So Rav Yochanan says, no, even if you don't remember at all. Rashi says, they both say, listen to this. So, interesting machlokes. Rav Huna says, you could write down stuff, but you always have to remember something about the event without looking at the paper, right? Rav Yochanan says, even if you remember nothing, but when you look at the paper, that jogs your memory, you remember a little bit, that's fine. That's fine. Then I will say, now what's happening? Look at the rest of that Rashi. Listen to this. So we'll say, so Rabbi Yochanan says, even if you remember nothing without looking at the paper, but once you look at the paper, it jogs your memory. Now you remember more details, that's fine. However, about ino niska lagamre, lo. I will say, if you remember nothing about this event, nothing, and all you're doing is reading off a piece of paper, that type of edus does not work. Why not? Rebbe say this is incredibly important. In halacha, testimony has to be something that is the result of cognitive recall. Right? A cognitive recall, you have to remember events. If you don't remember an event and all you're doing is reading off a piece of paper, ultimately, again, that is not testimony. So this is fasting. So look what's happening over here. Ruvain is witnessing something that he knows is important. The type of testimony that he may be asked about years later. So what does he want to do? He wants to write it down. So say he can write down the facts as they were. So does that work? Machlokes Rav Huna and Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Huna says it works, but he's always got to remember something, even just some fact without accessing the paper. Rabbi Yochanan says no, even if he remembers nothing, as long as when he accesses the paper, it jogs his memory somewhat. So now he has some level of cognitive recall. That's fine. But even Rav Huna says if he remembers nothing at all and all he's doing is reading off the paper, that's not edus. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabba says, Shemam Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So learn out from Rabbi Yochanan something interesting, which is Hanu Beitrei. Listen to this. Tiyadi Sadusa Umenashi Chad Benayu Mitkar Chad Lechave. Rabbi say, watch this. Therefore, if you have two witnesses who witnessed something, and one of the guys forgot, so one witness could remind the other witness. I was about to say, so it's interesting, because without this Gemara, I would say one witness reminding the other witness is what? Tampering, right? It's called witness tampering, right? It's called kosher. You can't do that. To which the Gemara says, no. What you can do is, if two guys witness the same event together, one could try to coax the memory of the other. And as long as the second one ultimately has cognitive recall on his own, he then remembers, oh yeah, now, and everybody's like, it's my simcha chol yom, right? You don't remember something. Somebody kind of throws you like a factoid, and then like, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember that, and then it jogs the memory. That's mutter. Quite incredible. But listen, ibaylahu atzmo mai. This is fascinating. What happens? Rashi says atzmo mai imbal din atzmo maskira echnis kamar. I will say, listen to this. Ruvain lent Shimon $1,000. About A lent be $1,000, and Ruvain and Shimon were the witnesses. So now B contest never happened. So they come to Beis Din. Reuven and Shimon show up. Reuven says, listen, the truth is, I don't remember the details. They will say, could the lender say to Reuven, oh, Reuven, you remember. Remember there was this, there was that, we sat at my house, I sat at my table. So I will say, is essentially the reminding permitted to come from one of the litigants. Right? Or is that permitted? So the Gemara says, listen to this. So Rav Chaviva says, yes, even one of the litigants is permitted to go ahead and remind the witnesses. They're both saying the witness has to have some level of cognitive recall on his own afterwards, but the shaila is it permitted for one of the litigants to like dangle the fact in front of the witness in order to go ahead and get him to remember? So Rav Chaviva says, yes. No, the litigant can't do it. V'chas Rabosai, the halacha is atzmo lo, which Rabosai makes sense, because Lamaisa, again, if you're going to have a situation where, again, litigants can start, quote unquote, reminding witnesses as to what has occurred, it kind of throws into also because, the mind is interesting like that sometimes the way someone says something also could slant the way that I recall it, which is quite fascinating as well. So halacha l'maisa, as much as one witness could remind the other, ultimately, again, litigants cannot go ahead and remind the witnesses. Listen to this. But if the aid is a Talmid Chacham, afilu atzmo, then ultimately, again, even the litigant could remind the witness. What's the reason? I will say, look at Rashi, afilu atzmo, top line on Rashi. Shabal din, the tzorah de rabbanon, ilav dechi rami anafshe, midkar shapir, lo hava samuch asveika lameka basudi. So I will say, the concern is, in a case where it is one of the litigants who's dangling or who's providing the facts to jog my memory, is that the witness may lie consciously, subconsciously. But if the witness is a tzar mirabban, is a Talmid Chacham, one of the hallmarks of a true Talmid Chacham is MS. Talmid Chacham is supposed to be the ambassador of the Ribono Shel Olam. The Ribono Shel Olam signet, right? His signet is MS, and therefore ultimately, again, the Talmid Chacham also has to have emes. So if it's a Talmid Chacham and he's the aid, he's not going to say anything that he does not remember on his own. Therefore, even if he's quote unquote reminded by one of the litigants, it does not go ahead and invalidate his testimony. Listen to this case. Kihad Rav Ashi, listen to this. Kihad Rav Ashi, Haviyadia lebesadus Rav Kahana. One time, Rav Ashi knew testimony on behalf of Rav Kahana, whatever the case was. Amar lei, Midokir mar haisahadusa. So Rav Kahana said to Rav Ashi, do you remember the testimony? Right? Do you remember this event that you witnessed for me? So Amar Leilo. Rav Kahana said no. I'm sorry. Rav Ashi said no. I don't remember any details of the testimony. So Rav Kahana says, V'lav hachi v'hachi ava. Rav Kahana says, really, you don't remember? This happened, that happened, this event, that event. Amar Leilo yadana. Rav Ashi said, look, I'm going to be honest, I just don't remember. The Sof Idgar Rav Ashi Asidle. Then at the end, Rav Ashi did remember. He remembered, and he testified on behalf of Rav Kahana. Chazi Rav Kahana dechava mechasim. He saw that Rav Kahana was like surprised. So Rav Kahana was surprised. Then I was saying, why was Rav Kahana surprised? Rav Kahana was surprised because he felt, how could Rav Ashi go ahead and testify? He didn't remember. He told me he didn't remember. So Rav Kahana was concerned that maybe Rav Ashi is only testifying based on what? Like the nuggets of information that I, the litigant, fed to him. So Rav Kahana was very surprised. So Rav Ashi, so what happened? So Rav Ashi says to Rav Kahana, Mi sarvis alecha kasamchina. Do you think I'm testifying based on the information you fed me? I remembered. While it might be true that your statements may have helped to trigger my memories, but Lamaisa, the testimony I'm giving here today, at the end of the day, is not based on what you said to me, but rather is based on my own power of recall. Incredible. So I will say, this story is an illustration to the previous halacha, which is as much as we say that halacha Lamaisa, the litigants are not permitted to jog the memory of the witnesses. If the witness is a Talmid Chacham, then it is permitted, because we assume that a Talmid Chacham is not going to testify to something that he does not have his own 1,000% cognitive clarity on. Another case, Rabbi say, Tanan Hasan, we learn, fascinating case. Hatelulios hakrovos bein le'ir bein ladera. So we'll say, telulios. What are telulios? Look at Rashi. Tile karka. We'll say these are mounds of earth. Mounds of earth. V'derech b'nei adam likbar b'tal mishum de'ein b'nei adam matam min haderech lavar alav. V'yevadech. Supposed to listen to this. Interesting case. You find mounds of dirt. And I will say, what's the concern when you find mounds of dirt? What's the concern? Grave. A grave. So watch this. Hatelulios hakrov. You'll see why this Gemara is here in just a moment. Hatelulios hakrovos. So say if you have mounds of dirt that are close, either to the city or to the road, echad chadashos ve'echad yeshanos, whether they are new or whether they are old, tameos. Ultimately, again, they're tameh. They're tameh. When we say tameh, is that we assume that there's a body there. Look at Rashi. This is very interesting. Echad chadashos shein zman rachok shlo haya kantel diikala meimar kevon dechadoshi im isa shenikbar sham meis Midgar dakirle, afa pitmeos misafik techevin dismuchali ir ikalamemar isha yichida halcha v'karva meifasham. Let's listen to this. This is the first halacha. If you have mounds of dirt that are close to the city or close to the road, whether they're new or whether they're old, they're tamei. Then I both say, now what's the pshat? If they're old, let's work backwards. If they're now because they're karov, well, if they're old, could be there's a grave somebody forgot about it. Even if they're new, they're still going to be tamei, right? Why? I will say now generally you would think, well, if they're new, if somebody was buried there, we'd know about it. We'd know about it. What's the concern? Sometimes when Rahman al has a miscarriage, and I will say the halacha is by a miscarriage, you have to bury the fetus. So sometimes what a woman will do is that we don't make a levaya, generally don't make a levaya there's not a levaya for a fetus. So what happens? Again, the mother would take the fetus and would bury it. But we'll say sometimes we'll see that she would not venture off far. She would bury it close by. We'll discuss the circumstances of that. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, if the mound of earth is close to the road or close to the city, we assume misafek that there's a body there and therefore it's tamei. Harachokos, what if the mound is further away? Again, we'll discuss what rachok means as well. Harachokos, chadashos tauros, if it's a new mound, then it's tar. Yeshenos temeos. If it's an old mound, it's tamei. So I said to the Gemara, Eza krova, Ezuhi krova, what's close? What's close? The Gemara says, Chamishim amma, 50 amas is close. Right? Ve'ezehi yeshana, what's old? What's old? Shishim shana, 60 years. 60 years. Not that 60 is old, right? For grave purposes, right? For grave purposes, that's called old. Div Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda says, Krova, shein krova hemeno. Close means there's nothing closer, right? This is the closest grave. Yeshana shein adam zochra. Old means no one remembers it. So the Gemara says, let's analyze this. My ir, my derech. What does it mean? What's a city and what's the derech? Ile ma ir mamish. If we say that city literally means the city and derech mamish, nisveika mi mechaskin antoma. Rabbi say, if we just say that city means a city and derech means a derech, out of Suffolk, we're going to make Eretz Yisrael tamei. We're just going to decree that every mound of earth that complies with certain criteria is tamei. Reish Lakish said, "Ila matzu v'taros Eretz Yisrael." Rabbi say, in general, halacha l'maisa, we are very reticent to ever declare Eretz Yisrael tamei, the earth of Eretz Yisrael tamei. Ila means an excuse. And when we have to find an excuse or a halachic loophole to go ahead and say that Eretz Yisrael is not tamei, we do so. So we're not just going to go ahead and just randomly declare mounds of earth tamei in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Zera, ir smucha beis hakvaros. Ir means a city that is close to the cemetery. The derech beis hakvaros. And the road means the road to the cemetery. So here we go. Bishlama, I understand why if you find a mound of earth on the road to the cemetery, Bishlama derech beis hakvaros zim nim sharimei nashma shosumakre kavro betel. Because sometimes it's late on Erev Shabbos, you have to do a levaya. There's not time to go all the way to the cemetery. So what do? They bury on the road to the cemetery. So I understand why such a mound would be tamei. But a city that's ultimately again next to the Beis HaKvaros, ultimately everybody just goes to the cemetery. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Chanina, mitoch sha'anashim kol rosham nifalehen umuke shchin zrasem. So I was saying, no, we spoke about this before. Sometimes if a woman, Rahman al miscarries, they would bury the fetus not necessarily in the formal cemetery, but rather somewhere out, right outside of the city. Especially if a woman is going by herself to bury the fetus, unaccompanied, she'd bury it close by. Umuke shchin, lepers, whose limbs sometimes, so I will say, the halach is you have to bury limbs also. A person loses a limb, has a limb amputated, there's an obligation to go ahead and bury that limb as well. Sometimes people would bury their limbs close by as well. So ad chamishim amma az le'ihi l'chada. So I will say up until 50 amos from this city, a woman would go by herself to bury the fetus. Tfei dabra inishbada ulebeis hakvaros azla. Any further than that, she would go with her husband, and once she's going with her husband, she would already go to where? Ultimately, again, to the cemetery. And so the Gemara says, Hilchach, Tuma Beretz Yisrael Mel Mechaskinon. Therefore, if you have a tell, if you have a mound that's more than 50 amos in Eretz Yisrael, you will not go ahead and establish it as Tamei. And Rabbi say, why is this important for us? Full loop around what this will conclude. Amar Rav Chisda, Shmamin Rabbi Meir, Hai Sadusa Ad Shisin Shana Mitgar, Tfei Lo Mitgar. Rabbi say, remember again, how do we begin our last sugya? I know testimony, and I'm afraid that what? I'm going to forget the testimony. So the Gemara discussed about writing down testimony. Can you go ahead and recall testimony from writing or not? The Gemara says something very interesting from here. What's the definition of an old mound? Over here, it's the definition of an old mound, more than 60 years old. So Rav Chisda said, you see from here, Rabbi Meir, that in general, people don't remember testimony for more than 60 years. They don't remember testimony for more than 60 years. So the Gemara says, so that's from this Gemara, to which the Gemara says, no, that's not true. That's not true. Velohi, hasamhu delo ramya ale, aval hacha, kevan de ramya ale afilu tubanami. I will say that's not true. When do people forget information? When they were never entrusted with having to remember it to begin with. So I will say, if there's a mound, no one was specifically tasked with remembering the identity of that mound. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, that is forgotten. But when people are tasked with remembering something, then by definition, even after long periods of time, they still remember. Abosai, what a profound Gemara for us to learn during Bein HaMetzarim, during the 3 weeks. Because Abosai, we remember things from a couple of years ago, from a couple of days ago, and from thousands of years ago. Why? Because we are tasked with remembering. Because a Yid has to remember the tragedies of the past. Because it's only Hazorim B'dima Berina Yiktzoru. Only if we sow the present with the tears of the past are we Zocha Miras Hashem to reap the incredible saplings of Geula. When you're tasked to remember, you could remember things for thousands of years. When it's L'Rami Alei De'inish, when you have no obligation to remember, then things could be easily forgotten. I will say Shkaya. All right, Chevron Zoom, great to see everyone. Mr. Ringo, Michael, Jerry, great to everyone. Morning, Mashi.